I still remember the exact moment the room froze. The executor had barely opened the worn leather folder when my uncle, Calvin, pushed back his chair and announced, loud enough for the oak walls to vibrate, "There's no need to drag this out. Dad promised me everything." He said it 100 times. The rest of us, my sister, my cousins, even the executor, just stared. Because if Grandpa had ever promised Calvin everything, he'd apparently forgotten to mention it to anyone else. Calvin stood with his arms crossed, chest puffed like a man stepping into a throne he believed was already his. The arrogance radiated off him. He had always been like that, loud, forceful, confident enough to believe that confidence alone could bend the world to his will. The executor simply cleared his throat and tapped the folder. "There are documents to review," he said. But Calvin wasn't hearing a thing. "He told me in 2005, and again after his heart scare in 2010, he insisted. "Dad said the farm, the accounts, the mineral rights, all of it, was mine because I was the only one who stayed close." Close. He said it like it was noble. Never mind the years Grandpa financially supported him, bailed him out, forgave the insults, ignored the freeloading, and absorbed every ounce of stress Calvin brought into his life. As Calvin ranted, something inside me, an old, familiar ache, tightened. Because for years I'd watched my uncle belittle Grandpa behind his back, mock his memory lapses, treat him like a burden. But today he acted like a grieving saint who had lovingly held Grandpa's hand through every final breath. The executor waited until Calvin finally sank back into his seat. Then he opened the folder. The first pages rustled softly. Legal language. Dates. Witness signatures. Calvin leaned back, smug and waiting. And then, halfway through the stack, the executor paused. His eyes narrowed. His fingertips pressed against a thin document near the bottom. Something older. Weathered. Carefully preserved. "There is," he said slowly, "an addendum dated 1989. Signed. Notarized. Witnessed." Calvin's smirk flickered. That was long before his manipulations, long before the arguments, long before the years he tried to isolate Grandpa from the rest of us. The executor lifted the page delicately, as though aware it carried weight far beyond the paper itself. "This," he said, "changes the distribution entirely." The room went silent. I felt the hairs rise along my arms. Because I knew what was coming. I knew in that moment that the truth, decades old and quietly waiting, was about to surface. Calvin leaned forward, gripping the table edge so tightly his knuckles blanched. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. "What addendum?" The executor inhaled slowly. And before he could say another word, I realized something else, something that made my pulse quicken. Grandpa had told me about the 1989 document. Not everything, but enough. I had kept that secret for 34 years. And now, for the first time, it was about to be read aloud. The executor lifted the addendum, and the door to Calvin's fantasies began to crack. "My name is Margaret Ellison, and I'm 62 years old. I've lived long enough to know that families don't fracture all at once. They crack slowly, then suddenly fall apart the moment someone touches the wrong pressure point: money, land, pride, or history. In my family, all four converged on the same battlefield. I'm the eldest grandchild and the one who spent the most time with Grandpa in his final years. Not because I needed anything from him, but because he was lonely, and I was steady. I brought him soup on Sundays, took him to doctor appointments, helped balance his old checkbook with his magnifying glass propped on a stack of mail. He used to call me his calm. I never forgot that. But my Uncle Calvin, my mother's younger brother, always resented how Grandpa and I got along. He treated affection as a currency and assumed everyone else did, too. If someone gave kindness freely, he saw it as a threat. When I was younger, Calvin intimidated me. He was tall, loud, and always 3 steps into an argument no matter who he was speaking to. But age gives you perspective, and perspective gives you peace. These days, he doesn't scare me at all. Even so, the day of that will reading, I felt something in my chest tighten. Not fear, anticipation. Because Grandpa didn't make careless decisions. If he wrote an addendum in 1989, I knew exactly why. And it had everything to do with Calvin. The executor, Mr. Hargreaves, cleared his throat again, preparing to continue. But Calvin couldn't contain himself. "What does it say?" he barked. "Read it." I watched Mr. Hargreaves study him for a long moment before turning to the page. His voice was steady, almost gentle, an intentional contrast to Calvin's aggression. "This addendum," he said, "addresses the inheritance of the Ellison family farm, mineral rights, and all associated properties. The room tensed. Even I drew a breath. Because the farm wasn't just land. It was the anchor of our family, 114 acres of soil, orchards, and history. It was where all of us grandchildren learned to drive tractors, where we spent summers under endless skies, where Grandpa taught us how to plant, harvest, mend fences, and work in honest silence. Calvin's jaw flexed. That's what he promised me. Mr. Hargreaves continued without acknowledging him. The addendum states, should my son Calvin fail to demonstrate sustained responsibility, financially, ethically, or with regard to family caretaking, the farm shall not pass to him. The room went dead quiet. Calvin blinked, stunned. What the hell does that mean? Mr. Hargreaves read on. In such a circumstance, the inheritance shall shift to my granddaughter, Margaret, who has shown consistent integrity and respect for this family's legacy. My breath caught, just as Calvin's chair screeched backward. He stood so violently the coffee mugs rattled. You're lying, he said sharply. Dad would never. But the executor held up the notarized signatures. My hands trembled. Not with fear. Not even with surprise. Just with the realization that the truth, quiet, steady, patient truth, was finally walking into the light. Long before we reached this explosive moment, the family dynamics had already been shifting like tectonic plates beneath us, slow, hidden, inevitable. Growing up, Calvin and my mother were opposites. My mother was soft-spoken, measured, and deeply loyal. Calvin was a storm in human form, charismatic one moment, cruel the next. The sort of person who mistook loudness for leadership. Grandpa used to say, Calvin burns hot, but not long. It wasn't an insult. It was a warning. By the time I was 12, I already saw the cracks. While my mother worked overtime to help Grandpa run the farm, Calvin borrowed money he never repaid, made promises he never kept, and drifted from job to job like a man allergic to accountability. Yet whenever he returned home, which was often, it was as if he expected a hero's welcome. He especially expected it from Grandpa. Grandpa, God bless him, never stopped believing Calvin might change. That hope shaped decades of decisions, some generous, others naive. But hope, like love, has boundaries eventually. As I got older, Grandpa confided in me more. Not about money, he never burdened me with that, but about disappointment. Worry. The fear that he'd leave behind a legacy of conflict rather than connection. He wasn't wrong. Every Thanksgiving, Calvin made some dramatic declaration. How he'd take over the farm someday, how he'd modernize it, how Grandpa would be proud. But he never lifted a finger to help. Not once. Still, the rest of us kept the peace. We tolerated the outbursts. We endured the entitlement. We swallowed the frustration. Because confronting Calvin always turned into a war. But now, sitting in that will reading, watching my uncle's face shift from arrogance to disbelief, I realized something profound. For the first time in my life, I wasn't avoiding the conflict. Grandpa had already stepped into it, back in 1989. And he had chosen me as the contingency. My sister Elaine leaned closer to me and whispered under her breath, "Did you know about this?" I didn't answer. Not because I wanted to be mysterious, but because 34 years of silence is not easily undone. Across the table, Calvin jabbed a finger at the executor. "This is a setup," he snarled. My niece manipulated Dad. She was always scheming. I almost laughed. Scheming? I had spent my adult life working as a high school librarian. The only thing I ever schemed about was convincing teenagers to read. But before I could speak, the executor continued reading. And the next clause made Calvin's fury break into something uglier. This addendum shall remain valid regardless of future verbal statements, as my son Calvin has, in the past, attempted to influence my decisions through pressure or misrepresentation. Calvin's face flushed a deep crimson. He knew exactly what that meant. So did I. But the addendum wasn't finished. The executor turned the page. And somewhere deep within me, a memory, long buried, began to resurface. A memory from the summer of 1989. The memory hit me like a quiet bolt of lightning, soft but deeply illuminating. I was 28 that summer, newly divorced, and staying with Grandpa for a few months to help him with repairs after a storm tore through the orchard. Calvin had also moved back in, although he spent more time drinking in town than working. One evening, I overheard an argument, sharp, muffled, but unmistakable. Grandpa's voice weary but firm. Calvin's voice slurred and desperate. "You owe me, Dad. You owe me the farm. I'm your son." Grandpa answered something about responsibility, about patterns that couldn't be ignored. Then Calvin said something that made my blood run cold even then. If you don't give me the deed now, I swear I'll make sure none of these grandkids ever see a dime. I'll burn this place to the ground before I let Margaret have anything. I froze in the hallway, my hands gripping the wooden frame. I had never heard him threaten Grandpa so openly. Later that night, Grandpa sat beside me on the porch swing. He didn't say what happened, but he did ask me a question. Do you think a man can love his child and still protect himself from him? I told him yes. I meant it. 3 days later, he went into town. When he returned, he had a folder, thin, cream-colored, with a crisp document inside. But he never told me the specifics. He only said, "Margaret, sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones you make long before anyone realizes why." Now, sitting in the will reading decades later, watching Calvin rage about how Grandpa promised him everything, that memory unfolded in painful clarity. This addendum wasn't a whim. It wasn't petty. It wasn't even about me. It was about protection. And now the betrayal, the one Calvin believed he had committed against us, was being revealed for what it truly was. A betrayal he committed against Grandpa, years before any of us knew. Calvin slammed his fist against the table. He wrote that because she manipulated him, he shouted. The executor remained calm. "Mr. Ellison," he said evenly, "there are logs of your father's attempts to provide you financial stability, loans, property transfers, bail payments. In contrast, Ms. Ellison," he nodded toward me, "never received financial assistance. That wasn't meant to humiliate him. It was simply fact. But facts, to a man like Calvin, feel like weapons." He pointed at me again. "You think you deserve the farm more than me? You think you deserve anything?" I didn't flinch. Not anymore. Because I knew something else, something I hadn't yet shared. The 1989 addendum wasn't the only document Grandpa had created. Hidden somewhere, in a place only I knew, was a letter. Addressed to me. A letter I hadn't opened since the day he sealed it. And now, with tensions rising and truth swirling to the surface, I realized there might be more in that letter than I was ready to face. That night, after the will reading adjourned, I drove straight to the farmhouse. The gravel crunched under my tires. The porch light flickered on with the same soft hum it had made for decades. I stepped inside, inhaling the familiar scent of cedar, dust, and the faint sweetness of stored apples. Grandpa's study was exactly as he left it. Books aligned with quiet precision. Desk clear except for a lamp, an old fountain pen, and the small wooden box where he stored important papers. The letter was inside that box, wrapped in a ribbon that time had faded. For years, I had resisted opening it. Something about it felt sacred, like a message meant not just for when he was gone, but for when I was ready. And after today, I was ready. But before I untied the ribbon, headlights flashed across the window. I froze. Footsteps crunched outside. Calvin. Of course he had followed me. He barged through the front door without knocking. "What are you hiding?" he demanded. "What did he give you?" I closed the wooden box gently. "I'm not hiding anything," I said. "You came here for something." His voice was sharper now, a blade scraping against stone. I stood tall. "Yes, I came here for peace." He snorted. "Cut the act." Then his eyes drifted to the study, to the desk, to the box. Before he could take another step, I placed my hand firmly over it. "This is private." "Nothing in this house is private from me," he snapped. "It's all mine." The old instinct, to shrink to avoid confrontation, rose for a moment. Then it passed. I wasn't 28 anymore. I wasn't afraid of him. So I stepped forward, closing the space between us. "Calvin," I said quietly, "you need to understand something. Grandpa made decisions based on patterns." "Your patterns?" He bristled. "You think you're better than me?" "No, but I think Grandpa deserved honesty. And I think he finally protected himself." His eyes darkened. "You'll regret this, Margaret." He stormed out, tires spraying gravel as he sped away. Only after the sound faded did I reopen the box. My fingers untied the ribbon. Inside was a single page, written in Grandpa's careful handwriting. "If you are reading this, Margaret, then circumstances have unfolded as I feared they might." My throat tightened. Calvin has a good heart buried under many years of pain, but I cannot entrust the legacy of this family to someone who has not yet learned to be accountable. I exhaled shakily. "You will know what to do when the time comes. Not with anger. Not with revenge. With clarity." I sat back. Clarity. The investigation wasn't just about documents. It was about understanding why Grandpa had chosen differently than everyone expected. But there was more. A second sheet of paper slipped out, something I hadn't seen before. A bank statement, a loan agreement, and a canceled check. Together, they revealed a truth far worse than I expected. Calvin had stolen from Grandpa. Not once, several times. And the amounts were substantial. I sat in Grandpa's study long after midnight, the documents spread before me like a map of choices. The canceled checks dated back to the early 2000s. Loans Calvin never repaid. Bank withdrawals he forged by convincing Grandpa to sign forms he didn't understand at the time. It was all there, in black ink, undeniable. And suddenly, clarity wasn't just a word Grandpa left me. It was a responsibility. I gathered the documents, placed them in a manila folder, and drove back to town at dawn. The executor's office lights were already on. Mr. Hargreaves was an early riser. He looked up as I entered. "I expected you," he said softly. I handed him the folder. As he examined each page, his expression grew more solemn. "This," he said after several minutes, "is precisely the sort of evidence your grandfather feared would come to light too late." I nodded. "Do you wish to pursue this legally?" he asked. I hesitated, not because of doubt, but because of the weight of the decision. "I don't want to destroy him," I said. "I want the truth recognized." "Truth has its own consequences," he replied gently. I knew he was right. We arranged a formal meeting, one Calvin would have to attend. A meeting where everything would be revealed. That afternoon, Calvin arrived with the swagger of a man certain he could argue his way into victory. But when he saw the manila folder on the table, that confidence flickered. "What's this?" he demanded. Mr. Hargreaves gestured toward the documents. "Your father kept meticulous records." As Calvin scanned the first page, his expression twisted. By the third page, his breathing changed. By the fifth, his shoulders collapsed inward. "This is taken out of context," he said weakly. "There is no context," the executor replied, "in which forged signatures and unreturned loans are acceptable." Calvin sank into his chair, suddenly quiet. For the first time, I saw not anger, but fear. He glanced at me. "What are you going to do with this?" I held his gaze. "That depends on you." "What does that mean?" "It means you can stop pretending Grandpa promised you everything. You can accept the will, fully, without contest, or we move forward legally." His eyes darted between us, calculating. Anger flickered again, then desperation, then something I hadn't seen in him since childhood, shame. "You want me to give up the farm?" he whispered. "No," I said softly. "Grandpa wanted you to earn it, but you never did." Silence spread through the room like a settling fog. Finally, he exhaled. "Fine. Do whatever you want. I'm done." But I could tell, this wasn't surrender. It was the beginning of consequence. The call came from the sheriff's office. Not an emergency. Not an arrest. A welfare check. Someone had reported Calvin living out of his truck behind the old mill, drinking heavily, shouting at no one in particular. When the deputy approached him, Calvin confessed the truth in a slurred, broken stream, that he'd lost the will reading, that the farm was stolen, that everyone betrayed him. But the deputy told me something else, something unexpected. "Ma'am, he also said he knows it's his fault." I stood there for a long moment, the phone warm against my ear. Consequences rarely come all at once. More often, they unravel a person thread by thread. Not to punish them, but to reveal who they truly are underneath. When Calvin agreed to meet with me a week later, he looked smaller. Not physically, but in energy, like a man no longer holding up a mask that exhausted him. We sat on a bench outside the courthouse. Spring wind swept through the budding trees. For the first time in my life, he didn't speak first. Finally, in a thin voice, he said, "I don't hate you, Margaret. I just didn't know how to stop being the person everyone expected me to be." I didn't respond right away. He rubbed his hands together. "I thought if I got the farm, it would fix everything. Prove something. But I never deserved it. Dad knew that." He looked like a man bracing for judgment. Instead, I spoke gently. "Grandpa didn't want to punish you. He wanted to protect the family. That includes you." His eyes moistened. "But responsibility is not erased by tears. You forged his signature," I said quietly. "You stole from him. You lied for years." He nodded, unable to look at me. "I'm not pressing charges," I continued. "But you will sign a document legally stating you will not contest the will, not claim property ownership, and not interfere with the estate." He closed his eyes. "That's fair," he whispered. "But fairness isn't always painless." Over the next months, Calvin withdrew from the family. Not out of spite, but out of a deep, raw recognition that rebuilding himself required solitude. He moved into a small rental outside town, started attending counseling, got part-time work at a storage facility. He didn't apologize often, but when he did, it was quiet, sincere, and without theatrics. His downfall wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It wasn't revenge. It was revelation. The truth had simply removed the scaffolding he'd built his life upon, and what remained was the chance, maybe the first real one he'd ever had, to change. But consequences work both ways. Because once the dust settled, I still had a farm, and a legacy, and a question Grandpa left unanswered. What was I supposed to do with it? The farm felt different once the legal battles, accusations, and tension lifted, quieter, almost reverent. One evening, I found myself on the porch, watching dusk settle across the orchard. The air carried that soft hum of early summer, when each leaf seems to glow a little greener. That's when I saw it, a small wooden marker near the old pecan tree, something I had never noticed before. The earth beneath it looked recently disturbed, although Grandpa had been gone 6 months. Curious, I crossed the yard. The marker wasn't a grave or a garden stake, just a simple carving. Legacy lives in care, not claim. I felt my breath catch. This wasn't new. It was something Grandpa must have carved decades ago, perhaps around the same time he wrote the Addendum. Maybe he never meant for us to find it. Maybe he meant for someone to find it at the right time. And the right time was now. In the months after the will reading, I began restoring the orchard, just as Grandpa once did. My sister helped on weekends. My nieces and nephews brought their children to run between the rows. Slowly, the farm wasn't just land again. It became the heart of our family. But healing isn't a single moment. It's a series of small, quiet decisions. One afternoon, as I walked the property line, I saw a truck pull into the driveway. Calvin's truck. He stepped out slowly, hands in pockets. He looked healthier, more grounded, less like a man grasping at something he thought he was owed, and more like a man learning to exist without demands. "I'm not here for trouble," he said. "I didn't assume you were." He nodded toward the orchard. "It looks good. Better than I ever had it." "Thank you," I said softly. A long pause stretched between us. Then he spoke again, voice low. "I wanted to tell you, I've joined a recovery group, and I'm paying off old debts, including what I took from Dad." I swallowed. That wasn't something I expected. "I can't fix everything," he added, "but I'm trying to fix something." There it was. Not redemption, but effort. Real effort. And that mattered. "Calvin," I said gently, "you're welcome here. Not as the heir. Not as the owner. As family." His eyes glistened. "Maybe someday," he whispered. As he pulled away, I looked out across the land Grandpa had spent his whole life tending. I felt his presence in the wind, in the soil, in the quiet strength of the orchard rows. This wasn't revenge. This was restoration. Of truth. Of family. Of myself. But one more piece still remained, the moral Grandpa wanted me to understand. It came to me the next morning, when I walked past the pecan tree again. The carved words felt like a final whisper of wisdom, and I realized what I needed to say. When I finally stood before the family months later, under the soft autumn light filtering through the barn windows, I felt the weight of everything that had happened, and everything that had finally settled into place. We had gathered for a small memorial planting in Grandpa's honor. Nothing grand, nothing performative. Just a circle of people who loved him, placing a young pecan sapling into the soil. When it was my turn to speak, I shared the words Grandpa carved so long ago. Legacy lives in care, not claim. I let the silence linger, because silence, like truth, has its own gravity. Then I continued. Grandpa believed that what we inherit isn't measured in acres or accounts. It's measured in how we honor the people who came before us, and how we treat those who come after. My voice remained steady, even as memory brushed gently against my heart. In the end, he didn't choose me over Calvin. He chose responsibility over noise, integrity over pressure, and he trusted that someday we would all understand why. A faint breeze moved through the barn doors. I saw my sister's eyes soften. My cousins nodded. Even the children quieted, sensing the weight of the moment. I didn't tell them about every document, every confrontation, every truth uncovered. Some parts of healing belong only to the ones who lived them. But I did say this. Justice isn't revenge. Revenge tries to break someone. Justice reveals what was already broken. And if we're lucky, truth becomes a place where something new can grow. After the planting, I walked alone to the old pecan tree, the one with Grandpa's carving. I traced the words with my fingertips, feeling the grooves worn deep by time and weather. Then I whispered the truth I had come to accept. Your legacy is safe. And so are we. Behind me, footsteps approached. It was Calvin. He stood quietly beside me, hands still, gaze soft. Thank you, he said. For what? For not giving up on the family the way I did. I didn't correct him. Some realizations belong to the one who speaks them. After a long silence, he added, I'm not ready to come back yet. But I'm getting there. I nodded. That's all anyone can ask. As he walked away, I felt a sense of peace settle around me, gentle, steady, earned. The farm wasn't a victory. It was a stewardship, a chance to rebuild what had cracked. A reminder that truth, when revealed without cruelty, has the power to heal as much as it exposes. Later that evening, I sat on the porch swing, the same one where Grandpa once asked me whether a man could love his child and still protect himself. Now, at 62, I finally understood the answer. Yes, love protects, even when protection looks like accountability. And that, I realized, was the moral of our story. Not that I won something. Not that Calvin lost something. But that truth, quiet, patient, steady truth, had its day. And in the space truth created, our family found a way to begin again.